What would you say organizations that are just starting to figure out how to do hybrid need to be thinking about? So those first things that they need to get in place.
I think the first thing to realize, well, actually, probably the most important thing is to start with listening to your own people, listening to your own teams, and understanding what's working today and what's not. Every organization that I've done this with successfully has, engaged their own organization through task forces, through groups of people that are, respected leaders inside the organization that have real challenges, right, in how they work. And figuring out like what are the problems that you're trying to solve? Is it an issue around, we see that engagement scores are faltering inside the organization. Do we have real productivity issues, meaning we have performance issues inside of one part of the organization, and focusing on how are we going to help people sort of solve those problems?
Brian, one of the things that you and I have talked about is this term hybrid and hybrid work.
The term hybrid work is this thing that we've started using for these patterns of how many days a week somebody needs to be in the office. Part of the challenge that I've got with it is it tends to default to one size fits all type of policies, which generally don't work very well. They don't get complied with in the first place, and it actually degrades employee satisfaction. It is an important concept, but it's an important concept as a part of a broader set of concepts around flexibility and distributed work. So flexibility is not just where you work, it's when you work. So flexibility in people's schedules, how many hours per day they have to be available and in meetings and nonstop, chats and emails back and forth. That has a bigger impact on their productivity and on their engagement as an employee than flexibility in where they work. And the second part is distributed. When we have this discussion about hybrid work, especially when it tends to default towards things like how many days a week somebody has to be in the office, what we often forget is that most of our teams are distributed. People are spread out across multiple cities, not just across multiple buildings.
Yeah, 100%. We've certainly found that with our organization.
When we're coming up with policies that say things like everybody needs to be in the office 4 days a week for time together with their team, what we tend to forget is that most of those teams are distributed, and that's the reason why you get the resistance.
Okay, so common mistakes, things that people kind of keep getting wrong.
Um, Probably one of the number one ones is the top-down mandate. I've yet to find an organization where the top-down mandate was the result of everybody at the senior level all agreeing that we should do a top-down mandate. Mandates themselves just don't go over well, even if they are well intended. A mandate that says, 4 days a week in the office for all of us is the right answer, generally sends a signal that you don't trust people, right? Anytime that you're resorting to policy bluntly in that way, it's usually not a great signal to your employees. What I have seen is organizations that have done a good job of saying, hey, look, we've worked with a number of people in different organizations. Here are the common things that we do think are important, and we all seem to agree on, which is new employee onboarding, training programs, socialization and relationship building, and complex problem solving are all things that we think are important. When we look at different aspects of different teams, that means that probably somewhere like 2 to 3 days a week is probably going to be the answer for most teams, but not all. What we want you to do is focus on the why. We want you to focus on these sort of purpose-driven elements of what works, as opposed to starting off with the policy itself as the answer.
Every few days, we feel like we're just hearing more on this topic, and
It's been interesting because it's one of these things where I kind of every once in a while go, I really think this is going to come to a close, but it never does. I was at Slack. Everybody assumes that Slack was this fully flexible, remote friendly organization. Less than 3% of our workforce was remote pre-pandemic. If you wanted to go remote, you actually had to apply to do it. And we basically put you through something that felt like a performance improvement plan, right? You had to hit certain milestones.
yeah.
I think the stuff that we're seeing now is problematic in a couple of dimensions. One, the phrase return to work is just horrible. And, it assumes that for the last 3 years, people haven't been working
Yeah.
when it's pretty clear, especially when you look at like US productivity being at an all-time high, that we're doing pretty well. The other issue is that the most fervent voices out there tend to be older white men who are not primary caregivers, who look like me, who often don't recognize that the people who most need and desire flexibility tend to be women, people of color, people with different abilities, and in particular, caregivers.
As a mother, the point about flexibility being as or more important than space is just, for me, is everything.
Our last set of data in 2023 was something like 57% of working moms want to work from home 3 days a week or more. 49% of working dads want the same thing, right? So it's a growing number of dads also. In all these cases, it doesn't mean that those people don't want to be together with their team. Most employees want to be in the office 2 days a week because at the sort of individual contributor level, that's about right if you think about their frequency of like how much of their time is spent on teamwork and social interaction versus individual heads down work.
Yeah.
And so if you find a way to, support that through tools, through technology, through the right practices and processes, you'll get on average about 2. And, if you're asking for 4, then people are going to scratch their heads and wonder why.
The office has changed forever. And there's still this question of how do we inspire people to come into the office?
The number one reason people want to come to the office is relationship building and socialization.
Yeah.
But where it falls apart is too often people are coming back into an office situation where it looks exactly the way that it did in 2019, right? If you're not rethinking the design of the office itself, it can be a real impediment, right? Back to that open floor plan that's 70% of the space. We really need to invert it. In our research, there was roughly 13% of employees that needed in-office space for heads down focused work. That means that if 70% of your space is dedicated to heads down focused work, you probably have it wrong. You kind of got to rethink the space as well.
Yeah, I was actually talking to a customer today who is doing a redesign of their office space, and frustratingly, a big focus of theirs is still around who's going to be where and when. Are they going to be here? Where are they going to sit? How regularly are they going to be sitting in these specific spaces? And myself and one of our CX leads was really trying to move the conversation towards kind of the activities that they're doing, activity-based working, and not how often are they going to be sitting in these particular seats.
Hoteling or hot desking has a negative connotation, but it's sort of the reality these days. The challenge is if you're not doing it in a way that supports things like neighborhoods, then it becomes really hard, right? As an employee, I probably do understand that that's a reasonable trade-off, that I no longer have a permanent desk, right? But I do want to make sure that at least I'm in the same area as the rest of my coworkers and colleagues that I came in to be with in the first place. As a workplace leader, you're probably more proactively thinking about things like, how do I drive energy? How do I drive, people bumping into each other? And one of the ways to do that is you compact the space down so that, the people who are coming in are more likely to run into each other.
If we imagine that we're in these roles, we're the folks that are having to put these policies in place, we're having to bring people back to the office if that's what we're being asked to do. Can you talk a little bit about how you might drive engagement? And that'd be the first thing. And then the second around productivity and maximizing that.
It's very different and a lot of pressure both on HR leaders and on workplace leaders. Often as an HR leader, you're inheriting from someone else, often on high, a set of policies that you're expected to enact when you've got employees who are resistant to that. So I think engagement's actually a great place to start because there actually is a really important element of getting teams together on a regular basis that drives employee engagement. My own stance on this is you should have a minimum of once a quarter gatherings for teams, even if they are distributed geographically across multiple cities, because there's data out there that shows that those types of gatherings are important in terms of engagement with one another, and it's also the way that you boost it in the first place. With my team at Future Forum, we did this because we felt like we didn't have enough engagement otherwise with each other, and it's most important for new employees and new hires. So finding a way to do that is important. I think that there's this phrase, the on-site is the new off-site. Bringing people into a space that you've got is a really valuable way of doing it. And there's other ways of sort of building that engagement too that cut across teams. So a lot of habits and practices from an engagement perspective that I've seen work have to do with things that are more like, how do we build local community? And so that can be everything from volunteer activities that are hosted on a local basis to lunch and learns that are hosted in the office that are really designed to say, hey, look, let's have the people that live in a local area, even if they cut across teams, come together for a way that helps them engage with one another. Productivity is another one where you really need to unpack it almost at the team level and understand what's going on. There's all kinds of studies out there that show that actually hybrid programs are probably the most effective when it comes to, academic studies of productivity. Raj Chaudhuri, again, at Harvard Business School, had one a year or so ago that showed that teams that come together about 25% of the time had the highest levels of output, quality, connection with one another. Like way better actually than people who are fully remote, and way better than people who are actually more than 40% of their time in the office, which is interesting when you think about it. The bigger shift I think that we all need to go through is please stop worrying about activity and start measuring instead outcomes. So the best holistic programs that I've seen around hybrid programs actually involve looking at a combination of, like, yes, utilization of our resources, but just, or actually more importantly, how are we doing against business outcomes, and how are we doing against key employee engagement things like retention rates, employee net promoter score, and using that sort of balanced scorecard to say, as we roll these programs out, what impact are they having, positive or negative, on the outcomes we're trying to drive and on our employees?
Yeah.
So you've really got to support leaders and managers in figuring out, just to play on the word cadence, figuring out the cadence, for their team. The leaders of those organizations, the leaders of those teams need someone who's going to guide them through how to build those practices, and they're going to need tooling to do it. It's one of the things we stumbled with even at Slack, which was, what tool are we going to use to figure out which days of the week we're coming together?